Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're doing a deep dive into something absolutely fundamental if you study ancient societies with writing.
That's right. It's that classic challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do you square what the texts say happened with what archaeologists are actually, pulling out of the ground?
Exactly. That tension between the story on the papyrus and the story in the dirt. We're focusing on Egypt today, but this issue pops up everywhere, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's universal for any field dealing with ancient societies that left texts. So, yeah, Egyptology is our case study, but we're really synthesizing how historians, archaeologists, anthropologists all tackle the past.
And what happens when their favorite sources just flat out contradict each other?
Precisely. What do you do when the text and the ground refuse to line up? That's our mission today.
Okay, so let's start with that fantastic example you brought up from Thucydides.
Ah.
It really sets the stage. Sparta and Athens.
It's perfect. Thucydides noticed this nearly 2,500 years ago. He said, look, if Sparta were destroyed and only its ruins were left, well, their buildings were pretty modest, simple temples, basic structures. Future generations looking at just the rubble would seriously doubt Sparta was as powerful as its reputation claimed.
Even though they were the dominant power in Greece for so long. But their material culture, the physical stuff they left behind, it was humble. It didn't exactly scream superpower.
It really didn't. A powerful gap there. But Athens, on the other hand.
Athens. Famous for its huge temples, the Acropolis.
Exactly. Thucydides figured Athens would look twice as powerful as it really was, judged solely by its impressive ruins. It perfectly highlights that split narrative fame versus physical remains.
But, and this is the crucial bit, for Greece, for Sparta and Athens, we generally have enough other information, enough text and context to figure out why there's a difference.
Sure.
We understand Spartan austerity.
That's the key point. We can usually bridge that gap for the classical world, but you're saying in ancient Egypt that connecting context, that bridge, it often just vanishes.
Precisely. In Egypt, we face these huge gaps, these lacunae, in the data. The very information we need to make sense of contradictory facts often seems to have just slipped away, leaving us kind of bewildered.
Which brings us to a really stark example of this bewilderment, the expedition contradiction.
Right. We have these amazing texts, especially from the Middle Kingdom, talking about massive state expeditions. Mining, quarrying.
Yeah, texts inscribed on stelae, both back in Egypt and, importantly, at the remote sites themselves. They talk about huge numbers of people being sent out.
And huge means.
Sometimes thousands. I mean, certain Middle Kingdom texts mention numbers up to 20,000 people sent on a single expedition deep into the desert.
20,000. That's like moving a whole town into the wilderness for months on end. Okay, so the texts paint this picture of massive logistical operations. What do the archaeologists find when they excavate the places these people supposedly lived, near the mines or quarries?
Well, that's where it gets really problematic. They find settlements, yes, foundations of buildings, some material culture, but the physical size of these places. They could maybe accommodate, at the absolute maximum, a few dozen people, perhaps a few hundred in the largest cases.
Hold on. The texts say up to 20,000, but the permanent structures fit maybe a few hundred. That's not just a small discrepancy.
It's a massive, glaring contradiction. It forces us to ask some really awkward questions.
Like, where were the other 19,800 people? Maybe they lived in, I don't know, simple shelters, tents that left no trace.
That's a possibility people consider. But think about it. 20,000 people living somewhere, even temporarily in tents.
Yeah.
You'd expect an enormous footprint in terms of material culture. Rubbish, essentially. We should be finding vast fields of pottery shards, right? From all the water jars and food bowls.
Or if they weren't using pottery for everything.
Okay, maybe. But they were eating. If you have that many people, you'd expect huge quantities of animal bones, especially large animals needed to feed a workforce that size. But often, that evidence just isn't there on the scale you'd predict. The archaeological signature for 20,000 people seems to be missing.
Wow. Okay, so when the physical reality seems to just completely reject the written record like that, we really have to step back and look at how we're even approaching this. How do these different fields, history, archaeology, anthropology, define what they're trying to do? Let's break that down a bit.
Sure, we can simplify it. History, broadly speaking, focuses on the human past in its totality. Events, social processes, cultures, ideas, the whole sweep.
Got it. And archaeology, its focus is much more concrete.
Yes, archaeology deals with the material remains of the past. That means artifacts, sure, but also things like seeds, animal bones, soil changes, we call those ecofacts, and even whole ancient landscapes. And crucially, it's not just about the objects, it's about their context, where they were found, what they were found with. That's key.
Okay, and the third player here is anthropology, studying human groups.
Right. Anthropology looks at humans and human communities as biological, social, and cultural beings. How people adapt, their kinship systems, their beliefs, their behaviors. And what's interesting is, while history and archaeology seem like the obvious pair studying the past, anthropology's influence is really growing, especially in how we interpret archaeological finds in places like North America and Britain, and increasingly in Egyptology too, because the questions raised by the material often push us beyond just the historical texts.
It sounds like, though, that alliance wasn't always quite so balanced in Egyptology. You mentioned texts often took the lead. Why was that?
Well, Egyptology sort of started archaeologically, with people collecting antiquities in the early 19th century, but then came the big breakthrough. Champollion deciphering hieroglyphs in 1822.
Ah, so suddenly they could read what the Egyptians wrote.
Exactly. And the philological side, studying the language and text, just exploded and quickly became dominant. Some scholars argue the whole field has operated in the shadow of texts ever since.
And these texts, tomb biographies, king lists, religious hymns, they were mostly written by and for the elite, weren't they?
Overwhelmingly so, which meant the focus of Egyptology naturally shifted towards political history, the history of ideas, religion, basically, the
Yeah.
concerns of the top maybe 1 or 2% of society.
So the archaeological data, the stuff reflecting maybe the other 98% of people's lives, got sidelined.
Often, yes. Archaeology frequently ended up playing a supporting role. It was used to illustrate the history already derived from texts, or to fill in gaps in the king lists like Manetho's list that formed the backbone of Egyptian chronology.
Which brings up another huge issue, chronology.
Hmm.
You're talking about the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, Fourth Dynasty, Fifth Dynasty. Like they're concrete facts.
Right, but those divisions are largely concepts created in the mid-19th century, based primarily on those textual king lists and historical narratives. They're useful frameworks, but they impose a structure.
How does that clash with the archaeology?
Well, if you're a historian working with texts, finding something dated to the 5th dynasty feels very precise. But archaeologically, especially out in the provinces, away from the royal cemeteries, it can be incredibly hard to tell the difference between, say, pottery from the late Old Kingdom like the 6th dynasty and pottery from the early Middle Kingdom like the start of the 12th dynasty.
So the ground itself doesn't always respect these neat textual divisions.
Not at all. The material culture often changes much more slowly or unevenly than the political history suggests. The physical evidence doesn't always cooperate with the tidy story told by the kings and their scribes.
That chronology problem really highlights how relying too heavily on texts can skew our view. So let's get into some specific cases where this has led to, well, major rethinks, where the sources really collided.
Okay, we got some great examples. First up, the debate over royal burials in the early dynastic period. Back in the 1950s, the archaeologist Walter Emery was excavating these enormous rectangular tombs called mastabas at Saqqara.
Right, near Memphis. Big, impressive structures.
Huge. And he found royal names associated with them. So the conclusion seemed obvious. These massive tombs must be where the earliest kings were buried.
Makes sense. Big tomb, king's name. Sounds royal. Why was that questioned?
While later, Barry Kemp looked much more closely at the context of those royal names at Saqqara. He pointed out they were found almost exclusively on clay seal impressions, like the stamps used on jars or boxes.
Okay.
And often you'd find seals of several different kings in the same tomb. That suggested something more like administrative activity sealing goods rather than the king's personal burial equipment.
So it wasn't necessarily his tomb, just stuff sealed in his name.
Exactly. Then Kemp contrasted this with Abydos, the traditional burial place further south. There, the king's name appeared on a whole range of objects inside the tombs, stone vessels, labels, furniture, much more personal.
So the context of how the name was used changed the whole interpretation.
Completely. It shifted the consensus. The Abydos tombs, though maybe less architecturally grand initially, were the actual royal burials, and the Saqqara mastabas were likely for high officials. Context was everything.
Fascinating. Okay, case study number 2. The cities debate. This one sounds controversial.
It was for a long time. Influential scholars like John Wilson and Wolfgang Helck looked at the Egyptian texts, the words used for settlements, the religious concepts.
And what did they conclude?
They argued, quite persuasively based only on the texts, that ancient Egypt didn't really have proper cities in the Mesopotamian sense until much later, maybe the New Kingdom. They thought settlements were primarily administrative centers or religious complexes, maybe not permanent, large urban populations.
A civilization without cities, based on language, but archaeology.
Archaeology pushed back hard. Excavations at sites Kemp worked on, like Abydos and others like Heracompolis and Edfu, uncovered exactly what the texts seemed to deny.
Which was?
Large, densely populated, often fortified settlements with clear evidence of long-term occupation, industry, housing, stretching way back right into the period of state formation. They were cities, by any reasonable definition. The ground proved the textual interpretation wrong.
Okay, next up, the Hyksos. Everyone learns about them, the foreign rulers who took over Egypt.
Yeah.
The texts paint a pretty dramatic picture, really.
Oh, definitely. Egyptian texts, written later, of course, depict the Hyksos period as a time of sudden, brutal invasion, foreign domination, and then a glorious, decisive war of liberation, where the Egyptian heroes expelled them completely. Classic propaganda narrative.
But what does the archaeology say, particularly at Everest, the Hyksos capital in the Delta?
Well, the decades of excavation there by Manfred Bitak tell a very different, much slower, more complex story. Instead of sudden invasion, the archaeology shows a gradual infiltration of people with Levantine culture starting way back in the Middle Kingdom, the 12th and 13th dynasties.
So less of a military conquest, more of a long-term migration and cultural blending.
Initially, yes. It looks like a growing immigrant population that eventually took political control during a period of Egyptian weakness. And their decline also looks more gradual archaeologically, not the single swift expulsion the texts boast about.
So is the text wrong? Or is it telling a different kind of truth, like how the Egyptians wanted to remember it?
That's a really important distinction. The textual account is absolutely a valid source for understanding Egyptian ideology, propaganda, and how they constructed their own history. It tells us about their worldview.
But it's not necessarily an accurate blow-by-blow of events.
Exactly. The archaeology, by tracing the material culture, the settlement patterns, the burial customs over centuries, gives us a better handle on the long-term demographic and social reality on the ground. It wasn't a sudden storm, it was more like a slow tide coming in and then going out. Different sources, different truths.
Okay, final case study. Linking the rise of the Egyptian state to famine.
Yeah, there was an older hypothesis based partly on some later texts mentioning hardship that the unified territorial state emerged as a mechanism to combat widespread famine, maybe through large-scale irrigation or grain storage.
Sounds plausible. A big crisis requires a big organized response. How do you test that?
This is where anthropology, especially bioarchaeology, comes in. Researchers look directly at human remains, the ecofacts, from the period just before and just after state formation.
Looking at bones and teeth for signs of stress.
Precisely. They looked for markers of malnutrition, disease, arrested growth, things you'd expect if there was severe, widespread famine driving state formation. And they didn't find it.
No evidence of mass famine.
No significant increase in those stress markers around the time the state emerged. In fact, quite the opposite in some ways. Studies of average height, a general indicator of nutrition, suggest that people were actually, on average, tallest just before the state fully consolidated. Height then began to decrease slightly afterwards.
Wait, so the state might have actually made nutrition worse for some people initially?
It's a strong possibility. It suggests that early state formation, with increased social hierarchy and maybe demands for surplus labor or grain, might have negatively impacted the nutritional status of the average person, even while benefiting the elite. Anthropology directly contradicted the text-based famine hypothesis.
That's incredible. And it really shows how archaeology and anthropology give us this unique window onto the lives of people the text barely mentioned, right? The non-elites, everyday life.
Absolutely. Texts give us the official story, the elite view. Material culture can show us everyone else. Think about a specific find from Giza from the Old Kingdom, the 6th dynasty, the burial of 2 dwarfs. They were buried in 2 separate adjacent shafts. But the excavators noticed something odd. One shaft floor seemed higher than the other.
Why?
Because it had been deliberately filled with broken pottery and debris before the burial, specifically to raise the floor level. The goal was clearly to ensure that both bodies in their separate shafts would end up lying at the exact same horizontal level.
Wow. They physically adjusted the tomb depth so they'd be level with each other. Why?
We can only speculate, of course. Was it to signify equal status in death? Or maybe, given Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife, the duat, was it to allow them to somehow communicate or interact across the wall separating them? There's no text explaining the specific act.
But the physical evidence screams intention.
Undeniably, and there's more. In one of the dwarfs' burials, they found the bones of 2 small dogs just tossed into the burial chamber, not carefully arranged. Again, suggesting some specific ritual practice related perhaps to these individuals or their roles, something completely undocumented in writing.
You just wouldn't get that level of detail from a standard tomb biography. You also mentioned another find that shed light on afterlife beliefs for ordinary workers.
Yes, the jeweler's tools. A burial, again from Giza, contained the tools of a craftsman, a jeweler, stone pallets, small tools, and crucially, a clay tip for a blowpipe.
Like they'd used to intensify the flame for melting metal.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Those clay tips, when you use them with fire, they get baked hard very quickly. It's unavoidable.
Okay.
The tip found in this tomb was unbaked, still raw clay.
Wait a minute. If it was unbaked, he couldn't have used it in life, it means.
It strongly implies he was expected to use it for the very first time in the afterlife.
That's amazing. It
Yeah.
suggests the duat, the afterlife, wasn't just some paradise realm, but a place where ordinary people were expected to clock in and continue their craft.
It completely reframes the afterlife for non-elites. It's this tiny, almost accidental piece of material evidence giving us a unique insight. The afterlife involved work, continuation of your earthly skills, and you needed your tools ready, maybe even brand new, for your first day on the job over there.
Which brings us right back to that core problem, doesn't it? We have these different streams of information, the historical texts, the archaeological finds offering such different perspectives. And as we saw with the 20,000 expedition workers example, sometimes they just don't seem to connect at all.
That's the serious challenge. They provide different views, and sometimes they are just irreconcilable based on current knowledge.